Okay, so what Kyle and I are doing is we're going to fit this fender onto this car. Now, this is kind of a tricky situation. This is one of the few things I don't encourage hobbyists to do so much unless they're really skilled at stuff. But fitting of this fender is not just a matter of finding a reference point and putting it on. The whole reason why you're changing fenders sometimes is because of accident work, which means other metals have moved. Now in this particular case, on the initial fit of this, as you just saw, there's gapping under here. The inner fender should be sitting right underneath this, and it's not. It's actually pushed over a little bit, so we have to bring all that metalwork over to get it to fit well before we can even reference this back on. Now, we're not going to set this fender on here based off of just a few points of reference of the car, because the car wasn't built that way in the first place. The hood was put on, fenders are gapped and matched to that. A couple videos ago, you saw this very same car when we got it back from the blasters, and they had split the fender all the way up here to move it over to create a gap that way. It's not a really, that's not a good idea, and that's certainly not a good game plan to do in any standard. But anyhow, so obviously we're not going to do that. We're going to set this fender where it belongs. And there's multiple things that impact how that fender goes. Right now, this fender is fairly malleable. We can move it wherever we want. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that it drops in, fits everything where it's supposed to be, and not assume that's the end. Because we have to have the hood on first, line it to the other fender, set the gap of this fender to the other fender based off of where the hood's at. And before we even do all that, we also have to have the cowling sitting up there. If you set these fenders just based off the hood gap, your cowling may fall short. So it's kind of a rookie mistake not to have that component and this component in place, because if you think about it, there are 4 reference points to the car. It's each side, front, and rear. Now we're not going to worry about the front because we can set that whenever we feel like it. But we do need the unadjustable components done first, which is this one. Get the cowling in, because if this is brought over too much, the cowling won't drop on. If you look at your car, you can probably see there's a very tight fit in between the 2 sides of the cowling, and no 2 cowlings are the same. So that's what you can see us doing over the next several hours. You happy with that?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so take your wrench and commit it right now. Let's tighten it down. Okay, so we didn't hard mount the hood. We have it slightly floating on the hinges. So now that we're happy with our gapping all the way around, he's going to tighten it up. But you really want to have somebody holding the hood, because if it moves ever so slightly, it's going to throw everything off. Tight? All right, so the one other thing we got to look at, the one other thing we got to look at this point is we have to pay attention to the horizontal pitch. We're pretty even right here, but it tapers down on both sides over here, okay? All that is spacers under the, or the shims under the hinges. Okay. So we're okay on that, and we don't need to do a thing about that. Now, if it was completely flat going all the way down, well, I've never seen that happen, especially on a reconstruct like this. So, you know, but the shims are factory shims, and they come in various thicknesses. So, you know, we're golden right there. The part that typically becomes a problem when you go to fit a hood to one of these is you'll see it even here and here, for example, but a high or low in the middle. You know, and so you have to assess what it is. Is it a flattened fender, or is it a buckled hood, and address it. So right now I'm really happy because we're squared here, tapered down here. We're good to go. Gap all the way around looks pretty equal. You okay with it?
Yep.
Okay, so now we got to put the door on to make sure that the door gap is committed to the vertical here.
All right.
And at that point, if everything works out, start drilling it and drilling the clecos to commit all this so it's always the same every time. And then we have to move this wall in. And then we start weld through prime. Snip it, because we'll drive back down and weld it up.
Okay.
You know, I don't want to remove it, because it's part of the cleaner effect when we're done.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So effectively, what we're doing now is we've established we can reach all our points of reference up there. Now the difficult one is We got our door is very well aligned, meaning up here, here, and this. So we have plenty of references knowing our door is perfectly in place. So now we got to set the gap of the fender, and this can be the most tedious part of this job. And the reason that is one, you're using an aftermarket fender. This isn't exactly an exact one from the factory. Doesn't mean it's bad, because it's not. They're actually quite nice. But because these are stamped in this, you got to see what's influencing. Right now, our gap right here is ideal. You get up here, I can stick a whole finger in there. All right, so what we have to do is we have to find out what is influencing this fender from aligning properly. And basically, in the stamping on this particular fender, there's a little bit of a notching up here that needs to be relieved so this fender can tilt back a little bit. So you got to look at every little thing, because every little thing influences how the fender alignment is with the hood, cowling, and the door. And this is why you have to have these items on. Can you imagine if we just put this on based off of what we had, how far off the gapping there would have been and how far off the gapping here is? It's a system, it's a process. Okay, you ready? All right, so we've now gotten our reference points from above and the door gap right where we want it. We're not going to change that one bit. This is where things get difficult, because though we have everything aligned this way, the panel itself towards the door is still kicked out. There's so many things you have to look at when you're approaching this. Jack point location, rocker sill, the fold around the window frame, everything affects everything. But there is an inner splash guard that's welded to this back there by the door. Again, these aren't factory direct units, they're aftermarket, and they're high quality, but they're still aftermarket. So that inner splash guard that's welded to this is a little wide, so we have to take this off to bring it in some so we can get the panel to drop. Every little thing. This is why you got to have everything on the car when you go to fit these, because if you didn't know that these things were not exact, everything else would be off, and then you find yourself putting a bunch of body filler on the car to compensate for a fender that just needed a little more attention to detail when you're installing it. Let's do it. And that's the piece we're talking about right there. What Kyle's doing right now is he's putting relief cuts in that inner splash guard. And what we'll do is we'll hammer tap down the rest of it so it'll match the contouring lines of our A-pillar. This is a simple way of approaching this to get a tailor fit to the fender. And once all that's done, we'll weld up the plasma cut reliefs and grind them smooth, and you'll never know that this was ever done. This is a far simpler process versus hammer and dolling the panel and then constantly taking it off and on. This way it's more or less a one-shot deal. You know, you put it on, find out where it's proud, set it down, tack it in place, and you're done. Once all this is done and it's completely fitted, then we're going to go back and tape off our areas that we plan on welding and spray the entire panel in epoxy as to preserve it before we put it onto the car. Okay, so our commitment, meaning clamps, are down here and they're up there. We have this pilled up because we don't want the window frame to influence how this fender lays. This is stuff that we can manipulate later, but what we can't manipulate is this style line right here without body filler. We don't want to do that. But we can't manipulate this, and we can't manipulate how this has a toe in, toe out situation. So anyway, we're going to get this firmed in. Now we're going to come back with our spoon dolly and mild hammering to collapse that relief cut you saw on the inside and get this to match. Once this and this are at the same decking, we're done hammering on stuff. At that point, we need to start committing some of the final shaping, and that's it. Got it? Okay, so taking the straight edge of a spoon dolly, we can see where we're high and where we're not. It gets high right here. It gets very high through here, and then it comes back to flat here. So I'm very happy with that. You?
Yeah.
And then it starts to lift right there. That's coming in quite well, right? Okay, the only thing we're really doing is we're not moving this metal, we're collapsing the inner splash guard. How you feeling about that?
Yeah, that's good. Maybe a little bit more in here. See if we.
Okay, well, let's see how much is.
Oh, yeah.
See, we only moved it ever so marginally.
Yeah, right up here where it's starting to.
Yeah, it's overlapping. Yeah, yeah. So that's exactly what we need.
Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot better.
There, and like that, you have basically a panel that is matching the door, the contour, everything's coming into play. It is a tedious job, but it is a necessary job unless you want to make everything up in body filler. Okay, so it is effectively almost a whole day for a couple people to get this thing right, because it's coming off, or it's going onto a car that had collision, but the collision repairs are, quite frankly, they're closer than factory tolerance. Anyhow, so the new fender, as you saw, the gap front to rear is fine on the door. Is an important reference to do. Our inboard and outboard adjustments are about as good as they could possibly get. So our gapping on the hood, gapping on the cowling, gapping on the door, all that's about as much as we would ever hope for. However, there is one spec on this that we can't compensate for because, well, it's just a matter of how it's stamped, I would assume. And that's the gap right here. We're going to fabricate and drop in on this so that gap is a little closer to match the other side. But when you think about it, at the end of the day, this is a car that had significant collision damage that drove that cross member, the inner wall, and everything else way out of tolerance. Fitting a non-factory reproduction, good quality one, reproduction fender on top of all that after it's been fixed, you got to know that you're pretty doggone close when you can make all this stuff fit the way it should. And again, without body filler, this is such a tight tolerance. So now that this is about where we had hoped it to be, next thing is going to happen is Kyle's going to start using the Clecos that we showed you earlier to anchor all this in, just so we have those points to which to re-secure this fender when it's time to start welding it in permanently. So anyway, so once he's Clecoed it in, we know that we're happy with everything. And he's going to tape off the perimeter where anything that's about to be welded. Tape it off, paint the whole thing in epoxy, the fender that is, peel up the tape, apply weld-through primer, and then we're ready to commit this fender to the chassis.
So now that we have our fender prepped and primed and on the car, we actually have it tacked in. Before we actually tacked it in, we got our reference points aligned, and we make sure that the fender is square to the actual specs of the car, and we have it true to the gaps on the hood and the cowl itself as well. So now that it's tacked into place, we'll go ahead and commit it along the lines. As you can see, we actually have copper primer in here where there's metal to metal contact, so that therefore the metal itself doesn't rust or corrode between the two substrates. So we'll go ahead and commit this fender to the car, and then we'll focus on what we need to move elsewhere. With that being said, one thing you cannot do is have this fender tacked or committed in any way to the car itself until you have the hood, the cowl, and the door on as reference points. Therefore, you get the true gap all the way around before you commit this piece to the car itself.
Okay, so Kyle and I have been working on putting the whole new front clip on this thing today and the last few days, really. And not everything is so easy to do sometimes. The aftermarket Fender is pretty doggone good unit. However, it's not an exact stamping of the factory, so an awful lot of finessing and shaping needed to happen before we can make this fit. Now we're going into the phase where we committed the weld on each side of the fender. It's still floating in the middle and on the bottom. The reason we haven't committed any of this yet is because we learned a long time ago, you better fit the grille, the headlight rings, and all the accessories that go in here before you commit this to a weld. If you don't, you may find your grille, headlight rings, which have pretty tight tolerances on this, may not fit at all. And that's something that'd be very frustrating if you already painted it. Don't ask me how I know. All right. All right, feels pretty good. Hey, that's actually really doggone nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
So now, if this were installed, see, this is why we do it. See that right there? All right, so is it on? Got a goober weld right there, yeah. All right, so we'll take care of that. So we're gonna put that there. Knowing doggone well we have to compensate for that weld that needs to get cleaned up. Yeah, I'm thinking we're gonna end up positioning these down a little bit. So with that in place, as it should be, and that's right there, this would actually turn out like that. So that would be like that. That's not bad at all. I mean, we have a little bit of work to do, but that's really doggone close. What about your side? And that's pretty impressive right there. Now you can see the value of doing this part. If we didn't do this, Okay, so in a nutshell, what's going on is we've fitted the grill, and we know that it's in a good location right now. It didn't go in easily though, because we had to move this up and we had to move this down. You know, these are not the most exact stampings in the world, but they are still pretty good. Anyway, so we've gotten this straight, we've gotten this straight. Now it's meeting to the profile in the rear. We have to remember we could trust nothing because the car wasn't in an accident, but we now have it where it needs to be, and there's symmetry and aesthetics and everything seems to fall into place. But now we're doing the headlight rings. Now this side has you can't see it, but there's some pretty nasty welds in there from whenever this thing was in a collision that we have to get rid of so this headlight ring fits properly. Also, these aftermarket nose clips, they're not exact. They're really close, and that's what counts, but they're not dead exact. So there's a little bit of profile clearance we have to do around the framing just so that these things come on and off as they should, because by the time we put primer and paint and everything else on top of this clip, it's going to make these fittings even tighter, so we need to have a little bit of leeway for adjustments or adjustability. Voila.